Is it really selfish of me to hope that this new Ghostbusters is a hit primarily so that replicas of props from the original series aren't monstrously expensive and hard to get a hold of anymore? New Ghostbusters. It's happening. It's happening in the summer, and we have a first trailer. If you're curious as to my initial reaction of it, I did an actual reaction video over in the break room of Geeks, so feel free to check that out. I'm still doing this here because I wanted to take the time to gather my thoughts a little bit more, and I did something I almost never do. I took notes. So, I don't generally do this. Generally, when I talk about trailers on here, I watch it and maybe watch it a second time and then just sit down and ramble it out. This one, I did something I almost never do. I sat down and I watched it like 4 or 5 times, pausing as it went, taking notes, noting down what it was that I was seeing that I wanted to be sure to talk about, and I'm going to reference those notes because, yeah, look, the original Ghostbusters is my favorite film of all time. Period. End of sentence. So I am really wanting to dig into the fact that I found a lot to like in this trailer. And the more I thought about what I was seeing, the more I liked it. And the more I caught on subsequent secondary views that I didn't catch in my first one that I did the reaction to, the more I'm kind of like, they're coming at this from a good space. Doesn't guarantee it'll be good, but they're coming at this from a strong space. So I'm actually going to go through my notes, and these are primarily done in the order that, things occurred in the trailer. So let's see. So setting, completely different. We've got a very rural setting here, which at first I was like, that's almost kind of the antithesis of Ghostbusters, isn't it? A big part of the thing of Ghostbusters was doing these sort of haunted house kind of things, the supernatural stuff in the middle of a city. Things like that don't happen in the middle of the city, which is true. But then you think about what Ghostbusters became and how ubiquitous it became. I'm not going to say it started a trend, but certainly within franchise, that's all it's ever been outside of like a few episodes of like the cartoon or maybe some comic book issues. So even though the idea of, ghosts in a spooky rundown farm, not exactly new, it is new for this franchise. And we actually haven't really seen the Ghostbusters approach to a more traditional haunted house kind of setting like this rundown farmhouse looks to be and this, more sort of isolated town is. So while in and of itself, that setting is not unique for a ghost story, it is unique for a ghost story with Ghostbusters in it. So the more I actually thought about that, because initially it threw me off that they weren't in a major city, but then I was like, okay. Like, especially if we're doing this whole rediscovering thing and it's not just a case of we're seeing, the business still up and running. If they're not doing that, and they're clearly not, it makes sense to shake up the setting a bit more in this way. What else have I got? Okay, so the whole thing with earthquakes kind of running through the town, that's kind of neat. Because first of all, earthquakes, they're just good as harbingers, so that's cool. And they're well thought out, and I also kind of like that it makes the threat, at least as far as what we see in the trailer, feel very localized. Now, it's possible this could still blow up into the world is at stake thing. I really hope it doesn't, because they could just keep it localized and like the forces here are going to tear just this town apart. That'll be fine, especially if we're dealing with young kids in way over their heads. That's a perfectly fine level of stakes. And that's the vibe I'm getting. So I'm hoping they don't overshoot the threat level. So they are bringing back the idea that the Ghostbusters have more or less been forgotten and ghosts aren't really a thing anymore. And one of these days I will do a video detailing my issues with Ghostbusters 2 in probably way more detail than anybody knows. But that is one of the things that I don't like about Ghostbusters 2. I will admit that it makes a fair amount of logistical sense as far as the lore of Ghostbusters goes, because in that original film, it is actually made pretty explicitly clear that ghostly activity is up significantly in anticipation of Gozer. So once that was dealt with, it makes sense that everything died off. And then Ghostbusters 2, it kind of came back up again when Vigo was trying to come back through. And then it would make sense that it petered out again. Basically, it's kind of been established that ghostly activity is not particularly high. Like, it's a very low background level unless there's something going on that's artificially sort of jacking it up, something like Gozer or Vigo. And keeping with that in mind, it does make sense that, you know, the Ghostbusters have kind of been forgotten a little bit. And it felt like a very meta moment, actually, when Paul Rudd, who I like, I'm not like, oh, Paul Rudd, like, I feel like a lot of people in my generation are, but no, he's cool. I like him. He's enjoyable. But it felt like a meta moment kind of when he picks up the trap and he's like, oh, great replica. And these younger kids are like, replica of what? And I totally felt for Paul Rudd, like, you don't know? But like, this was the most awesome stuff. You know, it's a ghost trap. You don't. Why don't you know that this is awesome? So I feel like they get a bit of that sort of cross-generational geekery stuff that didn't carry over to the next generation of geeks moment there a little bit, which is kind of cool, and I like it. But in coming back to that overall idea that things have died down again, on principle, I don't really care for it. But again, looking at the circumstances under which this movie is being made, which is a dearth of, like, it'll have been 31 years since Ghostbusters 2 came out, that this is coming out in continuity with that. So, bearing that in mind, this probably makes the most sense to do as far as if they're going to pick it up again and go with the storyline that they're going with. So while I don't love it, here I actually feel like it's a acceptable choice, whereas with Ghostbusters 2, I felt like there was no good reason for that to have been the case. So there's that. There was a great moment. I forget, I think it was right after like the trap, like a little stuff kind of came out and Paul Rudd dropped it. The four piano notes. I know those piano notes so well. They are from the original film, and I can even tell you the exact moment that those piano notes are hit. It's when they're down in the library basement looking for that original librarian ghost, and they're like, listen, smell something? There are things that hit me right in the nostalgia feels, and that was one. And they were surprisingly subtle things for the most part, with one exception. I'll get to that. But that made me happy. So, this establishes pretty cleanly. I did pick up on it on my reaction, but I didn't catch all the hints because I was looking at it on my phone. So I didn't have, a wider view of the whole thing. But this is absolutely Egon's granddaughter. And this is Egon's falling apart house. She's down in this, it's a basement or it's something, and there's a collection of spores, molds, and fungus. And I did not catch that on the first watching. And I'm not going to lie, and this is going to sound really stupid, I choked up a little seeing that when I caught it on my second viewing of the trailer. I'm like, oh, God. It is really sad that Harold Ramis is gone. And he was not only good in these movies, he was great, and he was a wonderful director. And I kind of like that by having this be his granddaughter and having this house be something that was left to them and effectively make it his legacy, it makes the death of Egon not be an incidental thing that they have to account for and cover just to explain why an actor can't appear in any way, shape, or form. But instead, making it core to the plot seems far more respectful, an acknowledgement of how important Harold Ramis was to this story. Because he didn't just play Egon, he co-wrote the scripts. He was really integral to this thing. So the level of respect I feel that this approach gives to him, or to him by proxy of his character, is was a really wonderful thing, and I honestly kind of find it touching. So that was really cool. And I also like that they didn't say it in the trailer. I'm sure they'll say it in the movie, but I like that they didn't say it in the trailer. It's just, who are you anyway? And she's pushing the jumpsuit aside, and there it is, Spengler. That's really good. I mean, I think that's a good idea for the story. And as far as constructing the trailer, that was really good. Okay, so moving on from that. Okay, so we had the really blatant nostalgia hit, which I was both resentful of, but also admit that it worked, which was the pulling of the line from Peter. Call it fate, call it luck, call it karma. And it sounded slightly weird, broken up, the way that they did it. But the fact that it sounded weird meant that I immediately recognized that is the original line delivery from the original Ghostbusters. I mentioned this in my reaction video, but the trailer for Force Awakens did something slightly similar by having Luke's line, "Force is strong in my family. My father has it. I have it." And the thing was in that, though that line was from Return of the Jedi, they had Mark Hamill re-record it. You could hear how the vocal quality was different and the intonation was slightly different if you are someone like me and watch these movies obsessively and have them completely memorized down to the exact cadence and pause between any word that was said. So I immediately caught that was a re-record line, and I also immediately caught that this was directly pulled in from the original. And like I said, it was a cheap shot, but it still worked. So, kudos, but I say that with a grimace. It's one of those things that, like, I'm ashamed to admit that worked on me. I wish it didn't, but yeah, it did. Tiny thing I really liked, especially the more that I thought about it. There's this moment, Paul Rudd's in this car, and like this clawed foot, like, thud on the hood of the car. I like that, because that's a monster. And that's something to remember about Ghostbusters. Like, we remember Slimer and, Stay Puft, but there were real tangible monsters, especially in that first one. I mean, the terror dogs, and just things could be more visceral and monstrous than just, the ethereal floating ghosts. And I like that this appears to have remembered that, which is very good, because I think it didn't occur to me before, but I think that might have been one of the things that the Ghostbusters reboot kind of dropped the ball on. It was all just ghosts. That's really all that was going on from top to bottom. And, that's fine and all, but, the original film brought in a lot more than just the ghosts. So I like that this appears to have remembered that, and I'm down for that. The gunner seat, that was kind of cool. And it's the kind of thing that, like, I imagine the Gunner would have added to Ecto-1 at some point between Ghostbusters 2 and whenever they just stopped doing what they were doing. So that was neat. So there was the ghost that they appear to be chasing through the streets. And I got concerned on my first viewing, again, looking at it on a phone, because it looked Slimer-esque. It's not Slimer. I went through this thing, I framed by framed it at a few points. First of all, this one's blue. And while it is generally shaped a bit like Slimer, overall, in a few moments I was able to pause to get a semi-decent good look at the face. It's definitely a distinctly different design. So they did not just bring back Slimer for no freaking reason, because that would have ticked me off. But they didn't do it. Whew. I think I almost kind of would have preferred if they'd gone with a ghost design that was not even really particularly reminiscent of Slimer. If they'd gone with something, maybe more thin and wispy, as opposed to, the sort of bulbous shape that he is. But I can roll with it as long as it's not him. And it wasn't. So that was a relief. I'm trying to think if there was anything else. The trailer did kind of lack a strong ending note. It just ends with the Ecto-1 skidding to a halt, but that wasn't a big moment because we'd already seen Ecto-1 driving at a few points up to then. So, it wasn't the strongest closing moment, but that's not an issue with the film. That's an issue with the trailer. And the one other thing I'll talk about, because again, I talked about it in my reaction. The idea of having it be young kids. Initially, my thought... Now, also, keep in mind, as I'm talking about this, I have gone out of my way to not try and dig into and go through rumors or leaks or, like, I don't want to know a ton about this story before I know about it. So, I'm sure there's some stuff that has been confirmed, and, like, the fact that this was Egon's relatives has probably been leaked and confirmed by other people elsewhere, but I'm avoiding all that crap, which I'm glad because, like I said, I got that, catching the spores, molds, and fungus, and picking up on that on my own. That was a good feeling. But anyways, as far as the kids go, my initial thought was, does it have to be kids? Because I know Ghostbusters have always appealed to kids. It appealed to me as a kid. I mean, that's a big part of why it's my favorite movie of all time. I grew up on that movie. I love it to death, and I have since I was very, very young. But I always kind of push back on what feels like very corporate way of thinking of kids will like it more if we put kids in it, which is, the mentality that, got Robin and Bucky inserted into the early comics and lends itself to kids' sidekicks. It's why, there were things like Scrappy Doo, or, there were actually, these annoying kid proxies in the later seasons of the real Ghostbusters, and I will always push back on that because at least from my experience, when I was a kid and I wanted to pretend and play Ghostbusters, I imagined I was a Ghostbuster, or I was Indiana Jones, or I was a Jedi. I wasn't a kid sidekick or a kid who, was with... No! But as much as that's sort of my initial gut reaction to seeing kids filling these roles, I think it's another thing that, under the circumstances that we have, might have been the best idea. So it kind of gets filed under the similar situation of the more rural setting. Because what were the other options if they were going to tie this directly into the original continuity? Option number one, bring back the original cast. Now, last I was aware, and again, I'm not going to dig through and find out because I don't want to know in advance, but last I was aware, the surviving cast is going to feature in some way, shape, or form. So they are going to be on hand, but we've all seen Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. There is a point where if a torch is not going to be properly passed, it's not fun seeing your heroes be old and crotchety. It's really hard to thread the needle on doing that. And I think having a film be primarily about them would have been a mistake and would have felt very just awkward. So other alternative would have been to, have a new team of people, say, around the age that the original team was when they first formed the business. But I think doing that, it really does... You can't escape the fact that you're dealing with replacements, where this would have been the original cast if they were young enough to still be doing it. But because they're not, here's these jokers instead. By having it be kids, it forces way less of a comparison. And you're not going to be looking for the Egon, the Peter, the Ray, the Winston of the group, because it's a group of young kids. Two of them appear to be siblings. It's a completely different dynamic. You're not going to do a one-to-one comparison, which means you're not going to be, automatically against these kids because you're like this character who I like more. Why can't I have them? And having it just breaking that structure and doing something as different as this versus what, the core team was before, does a good job of connecting it to that without all the baggage that comes with if you try and detach it while also recreating it at the same time. Jason Reitman is a very intelligent director, and I think he appears to have approached this with a very mindful eye. Because I think more than anything, the big failing of Paul Feig's Ghostbusters, which the 2016 Ghostbusters, I don't hate the way a lot of people hate it, but it's not great. But I think the major failing of it is that it approached it as just, a comedy, when Ghostbusters, the reason it's great is because, yes, it's funny, but it's also inventive and kind of scary, and it takes what it's doing actually pretty dang seriously. And having all of that fit together in a way that is fairly deadpan, aside from literally one character, and that's Peter, that was a big part of what knit all of that together. And Paul Feig just kind of went out and made a comedy. And it was a decent comedy, but it lacked the other elements. And it didn't feel as fully thought out as the original Ghostbusters. Though, to be fair, the second Ghostbusters didn't feel as thought out as the original Ghostbusters. Again, I'll do that video one of these days. But this, what I'm picking up from the trailer, and especially now that I've watched it several times and really thought about it, this feels very thought through and very deliberate, and it does not feel like choices were made just because. It feels like choices were made with the thought about what that implies and what that says. And that, more than anything, gives me hope. And oh my God, I'm actually kind of just slightly nervously, but excited to see this. I was not expecting that. I want to like it, of course I do. But knowing my love of the original and knowing that I haven't liked any of the other sequels or reboot, and really not much of anything aside from the best episodes of the real Ghostbusters, it really is just that first film for the most part. The more I think about what I see for this, the more I'm like, oh crap, this might actually work. Yeah, that's weird. Ghostbusters Afterlife. First trailer. What'd you think? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. If you could support me on my Patreon page, 'tis the season to be generous. I sure as heck would appreciate it. Also, I've got a P.O. box if you want to send me stuff. But beyond that, like, subscribe, share this. Share the growing enthusiasm and joy, almost, at a new Ghostbusters. I never thought I'd feel that. This is cool. Or, you don't have to do any of that. I mean, maybe, yeah, but at the end of the day, folks, you're the council. I'm just running the meetings, and until next time, this council is adjourned.